Hello, everybody. Welcome to the ABE I4 seminar. And today we're going to be hearing from Ross Wantland on equity-mindedness in agricultural and biological engineering. Ross is the Director of Curriculum Development and Education at the Office of the Vice Chancellor's Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Urbana-Champaign. And he's a farm-raised social justice and violence prevention educator with nearly 20 years of experience in this field. And he's just recently started this role at the Chancellor's Office. So just to give a little bit of a background, so this semester, we wanted to focus specifically on equity and diversity and inclusion, given the events that happened in the summer and overall just the events that are happening around us. And as you've seen the seminar speaker series, everything is kind of designed to help promote equity and inclusion. And so today we're really eager to hear from Ross and what he has to say about that.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. I am excited to talk with you all a little bit about this notion of equity-mindedness and the ways that it applies to the work that we do, the work that you all are engaged in agricultural and biological engineering, as well as the broader work of being part of an institute for higher education, of working to be members of our community and our homes, as well as our classes and labs and workplaces, etc. I do want to start us out with a land acknowledgement to acknowledge that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. And these lands are the traditional territory of these Native nations prior to their forced removal and continue to carry the stories of these nations and their struggles for survival and identity. At the University of Illinois, we have an obligation to reflect on the peoples of these lands and the stories of dispossession, and to recognize that space is one of the ways that we make sense of the world around us and whose spaces we are on. That I think is important as we frame our conversation around equity-mindedness, as we think about both the apparent, like in our face, ways that equity and inequity happen, as well as the historic and subtle ways that inequity and equity occur. I want to read a quick quote by D.L. Stewart, a friend of mine who is now at Colorado State University, in an article in Inside Higher Education talking about the challenges of language. Says, diversity asks, who's in the room? Equity responds, who is trying to get in the room but can't? Whose presence in the room is under constant threat of erasure? Inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been heard? Justice responds, whose ideas won't be taken as seriously because they aren't in the majority. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I've been working at the University of Illinois for about 20 years now. I came in as the Sexual Violence Prevention Educator within the Women's Resources Center. And after having worked for a couple of years at rape crisis centers and domestic violence shelters in the Champaign-Urbana area, I came to that work as a cisgendered white man who got hit, was first generation college student, navigating and thinking about beginning to be kind of introduced to thinking about what is my place and position within the world around me? How do people who look like me and talk like me, how have they been represented in spaces and places, in places like institutions for higher education? How in an institution for higher education are my interests or needs accounted for? How aren't the needs and interests of others accounted for over time? And so it's been an opportunity as I've moved from doing sexual violence prevention education, working a lot with cisgendered men to think about what are the ways that men have a role and responsibility in addressing and preventing sexual and domestic violence, to thinking in additional ways about not about gender, about race, about sexuality, about ability status, about nationality, about religious identity. What are the ways that that we are in contexts that may either represent what is expected to be the interests of people in our group, or that deny or exploit or overlook and ignore or hyper surveil and police the interests of people in groups that we might belong to. And so that's sort of how I come to thinking about this question of equity and equity-mindedness, is what is my responsibility in the spaces that I'm in to think about equity and to think about my role and responsibility to promote equity from the positions that I'm in. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what an equity-minded approach might look like in practice, and talk a little bit about how might that look in the spaces that you might be in, recognizing the subtle ways that inequity might operate, and to think about what are our personal strategies to support and promote equity. My assumptions today that I come in with is that racism, sexism, ableism, classism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, other forms of oppression, they harm our workplaces, classrooms, and communities. They not only harm individuals, but they also hold back our communities from full and equal participation, from the capacity of what they could achieve was everyone able to be able to show up and to be fully participate. We also, I believe that we all hold biases and stereotypes that we have picked up from the air around us, from the culture, from our loved ones who have communicated these biases and stereotypes. Sometimes with biases and stereotypes, we can hold them even though we have very little interaction with the people who we hold these biases and stereotypes about. And so these biases and stereotypes are inaccurate stories that are told about the groups of people that we interact with, and we have to challenge those in many different ways. I believe we've all been impacted by these systems of inequality, whether those systems of inequality have given us an advantage over others and have where maybe we have been seen as sort of the better candidate or the better person, simply because of how we looked or how we talked or how we showed up in spaces, and not about our skills or our talents or our preparation. Or we have been denied that access and opportunity. I also think that in this conversation today, what I would love for us to do when we're chatting is to speak from our own individual experiences, because that's where that's where we have an immense wealth of expertise, is what is our own unique experience and context. I know that we all come from very different places, both within the United States and outside of the United States. And so these dynamics that we're talking about are not just sort of United States-based dynamics around questions of identity, but also how those might play out in other spaces. And I think in the end, I think that we're here because we want to figure out our ways that we come together to resolve these issues. And so I think that we have to come together. And so what is our collective opportunity to come together? This was, I've seen lots of different ways of framing equity versus equality. And this was a picture from Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree that illustrates what inequality to justice might look like. So inequality, as you see, the tree is bending to one of the children and more of the fruit is falling to one side, is an unequal access to opportunities. So that where one person is positioned, they have more resources and more opportunities that are available. Equality might be an even distribution of resources. So everyone gets the same size ladder, but when they put that ladder up and wherever they might be standing, it gives them different access to the resources that are there. So evenly distributed tools and assistance, whereas equity then is this next step, that the tools are custom identified to, or customized to identify and address inequality that may exist. So I sometimes use the analogy of a t-shirt, that if all of us got small size t-shirts that all had the same logo on it, that would be equality, but it might not look really cute on me, the smallest t-shirt. And so what does that mean that we suddenly, that to have the things that meet our needs? needs. So we all have the same size t-shirt, for instance, in that analogy. And then justice, which is kind of one more step beyond equity, is not just having the tools that for the time being give people the access to the same objectives and goals, but justice is actually fixing the system, going upstream in this sort of river analogy, and repairing the damage so that on as you look downstream, then people all have access to the tools and the opportunities. So in this case, they both have ladders, and their ladders are both able to reach because they have worked over time to repair the tree so that it is everybody's able to reach the fruit. I want to do thinking about what inequality and equity look like. I want to do a quick activity, and I'd like you to. I'm going to have you do this individually, and then I'm going to have you use the chat. And there is a picture of Dr. Evil from the Austin Powers movies, because I'm going to have you engage in what's called negative creativity. Negative creativity is a tool we use sometimes to help people think about what are the bad things that could or might happen. And so I'm going to ask you to do that. So if you were to create an organization that was designed to exclude, exploit, or erase certain individuals without getting into trouble, and this part is important, whether that be legal trouble, whether that be more informal trouble where the people would have a negative opinion of you because of the things you did, what would you do? So take a moment and just think to yourself. I'm going to give you a few seconds to just think to yourself, what would you do if you were tasked with building an organization or a space that would either exclude, leave people out, or deny them entrance, exploit, utilize their labor and not credit them or not give them full compensation for it, or erase, actually to sort of eliminate the kind of existence of, in some ways, individuals, but doesn't get you in trouble? What would you do? So in the chat, what I'd like you to do is to write down what strategies you think a group would employ to promote inequity. What are some things you think groups could do, again, formally or informally, to create or continue inequity? Okay, Tony said vote for Trump. Okay, so that their voting power might be a way that people might continue to kind of maintain a certain set of power, a certain set of ideals. So say you're a brand new organization, what might be the sort of like informal or formal ways that you could do this without getting into trouble? Think about, so Nicholas says, I would think about how I would need to accommodate to certain groups of people and ensure that there's no way to accommodate, or at least really annoying to accommodate. So just be like, well, we really tried, and we just can't, we don't have the resources to accommodate these people. Gosh darn it. I think alongside that, you could also frame those needs as not the needs of the majority. So we're helping the most people get what they need, and we just can't attend to kind of special interests or these special needs. What else? That was a good one, Nicholas. Set rules and standards that are within the constitutional rights of everyone that would identify some traits and behaviors that are uncommon. Oh, interesting. So say, well, we're doing the sort of like bare minimum of the law, and but we can't do this for everyone. Create a contest aiming for that person. Jafari too. Can you say more about a contest? What would that look like? You can unmute yourself if you want, or you can chat it.
Like a test or survey, and oblige people to do the test, and the person with the lowest score should leave.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I mean, think about the ways that high stakes testing or even entrance exams for different programs that we're in, like reminds me of the origin of the IQ test. Thanks, Nicholas. Yeah. So there might be like tests, and we say this test is fair, and so then this test must be fair. It reminds me. So I think I mentioned I grew up on a farm. When I went to my kindergarten entrance exam, my mom loves to tell this story. They showed me a key and they said, "What is this for?" And it was one of those old skeleton keys, not that anybody really uses those. And I was supposed to say, "It unlocks a door." And all I was just like, it turns on a car. And they were like, "No, no, that's not what the answer is." And uh, I came from a context where we didn't lock our doors. Like I'd never seen a key used in a door because where I lived in the area I was in, we never locked our doors. And so there were a couple different things that happened there where they said, well, this is the right answer, but depending on the context, that's not the answer that everyone would use to identify things. So who's the test norm to, who's it established to? Being sweet on the face, but but backstabbing, not entertaining the ones you don't want with their rightful needs. Yeah, so being very kind of cordial, but also changing the ways that you are operating. Denying that there's inequity, and so you could use use Fox News as your outlet as the example here. Yeah, so. But so, yeah, say, there is no inequity. There is no difference. So not listening to what people might be naming as their needs or as power differentials. So Chelsea mentions voter suppression, funding private schools. So, people don't usually say, hey, I'm going to create voter suppression. Like what I'd really love to do is disenfranchise millions of voters. What they say is, I'm going to shift the boundaries of this voting area to better achieve the kind of like whatever my kind of voting goals. Or so the way that they describe it doesn't say we're going to create voter suppression. The impact might be to suppress the votes of people or to change who has access to voting. Funding private schools, then, for instance, might be a way to deny, to say, well, we just really want the best to get their opportunities, and but then limit the people who have only public school access, or like I think Annie's saying. So the Annie then says also advertising opportunities for advancement only to a subset of the group. Oh, I'm sorry you didn't get that email. Like I sent it out to everybody, but if you only give that insider information to certain people, these are really these are exactly the things that happen within groups that might create or continue inequity. And part of why I want you to think about this is, I think that some of them might happen on large scales, like voter suppression, for instance. Some of it might happen on very immediate spaces within classrooms or within labs or within departments, and that might look a little differently. Inequity can show up in a variety of spaces. I think that obviously there's us as the individual and the impact it has on us and the ways that we've internalized these messages of inequity, whether that we're taught to see them as kind of reasonable and just and fair, even when things may have very unfair, people might be treated in very unfair ways or inequitable ways. There might be interpersonal kind of dimensions of inequity where that is the ways that myself and another person engage with one another, and how are they treating me, and how is that impacting me? How am I treating them, and how is that impacting them? There are the structural policy, rules, laws, practices that happen around us that determine things. I was just in a training, we were talking about the provost communication number 9 around promotion and tenure. So there's conversation right now about how do we change the promotion and tenure practice to recognize the things that many underrepresented faculty are expected to do more of, like community work and committee work, and actually acknowledge that those are that is labor for which can be considered for promotion and tenure. Whereas if folks maybe spend all are asked to spend all this time with these things outside of research, they may not get promotion and tenure. So how do we change those structures? And then cultural and societal. What are the messages? What are the ways of belief? What are the, you know, I think cultural and societal even is, who do we see as the heroes and heroines of, you know, say our particular fields, or of like our academic areas? What are the stories that are told about what it means um, to be successful and who can be successful? So what are the things that might live outside of the policies and rules and interpersonal engagement that are carried socially? Now, equity matters for a number of reasons. I believe firmly it improves all of our lives. It improves my relationship. If I'm in a space where I'm in a more powerful position, but I am, you know, status-wise, but equity is able to be promoted and created, I might lose, quote unquote, lose some positional status. I might lose some opportunities that I had just by virtue of how people saw me and the perceptions. But the ways it improves my life is it improves my ability to have real relationships and to understand in the ways that things are operating around me. It addresses historic and present day inequities. It increases the diversity of the teams. And a lot of research shows not only does it increase the quality of work when we have more diverse teams that are able to come to the table together, but it also creates more unique solutions that teams that are working together that are more diverse, where everyone's able to come to the table, are able to create divergent ideas that are more flexible and don't just follow traditional paths for solving those issues. And I think also then it's also congruent with our values. It's congruent with our values of inquiry, our values of that everyone should have an opportunity to be within higher education if they are committed to the field and committed to the study and committed to the work. I want to talk with you a little bit about this process of equity-mindedness, which comes from the Center for Urban Education of the University of Southern California. Equity-mindedness is a practice, and I appreciate it in large part because as a practice, it looks at both what is the awareness I need to have or we need to have as a group, and what is the individual role that I need to take. And it's shaped like a brain. So to just think about this as a mindset. So equity-mindedness consists of these 5 things, which I'll talk about in more detail. Equity-mindedness is both race conscious, race aware. It's systematically aware. It's institutionally focused, evidence-based, and also it advances equity. It works to advance equity. So what that means is that to be race conscious, and in this case, we're talking particularly around race and racial and ethnic difference and inequities that exist within systems, where people of certain racial groups do not have the same opportunities and access or the same outcomes within spaces. So part of that means we have to be race aware. One of the tendencies in our society is to pretend that racial difference is not present, or that that people will say, well, I don't see race. I treat everyone the same. That does 2 things. That's something called race evasion, where people say, by saying that I don't see race, that they are actually denying the kind of racial and cultural differences that might exist among folks. But also it is a power evasion. It denies the ways in which people might have different experiences in the world around them that might belie different status and different opportunities and access based on their racial identity. So we have to be race conscious. We have to say, I want to acknowledge race. I want to think about race. I want to talk about race. And we're not going to just dance around it. We're actually going to use that as a place of analysis when we're thinking about what equity looks like. It also means that there is a systematic awareness. So we are thinking about that when we talk about racism, for instance, that we're not just thinking about the individual in front of me. I'm also thinking about historically how have people racially been allowed into my field? What has that access looked like? What is the experiences before people get to the university that people may have had, whether those be sort of like in school preparation, whether those be in resources that folks had available, in opportunities. I think one of the things that we see happen a lot is that we know that racially and class-wise, that there are some expectations that people might have things like unpaid internships before they are positioned to be able to get into certain fellowships or programs, and who can afford unpaid internships, and what does that look like to have to take on those experiences. So thinking systemically, thinking about these as a system. Thinking about this as an institution, meaning that we have to say, what is the responsibility of the organization that I am within to address these problems? So how do we think about this as policies and practices and rules and laws, and what is it that, how those policies, practices, rules, laws, how those mechanisms of the institution may promote or deny equity. Are evidence-based then also? So I think it's also really important that we have evidence-based because, because we need to know if the things we're doing to promote equity are working, but we also need to know how we define the problem. Sometimes with questions of inequity and equity, we will use stories to say, well, we know this happens because I have this one story. And so this anecdotal evidence gets used a lot rather than saying, well, what would we need to measure to know what the impact is? How do we look at the demographics of our department? How do we look at the demographics of who applies? How do we look at the demographics of whose work are we reading, or who are we attracting as candidates for positions? So looking at what evidence we have and ways we might measure that evidence to use that to guide our work. And then finally, believing that it's our job. So I think that equity advancing really refers to, so I'm systematically aware, I'm focused on the institution and the ways we can change and better ourselves in the institution. I'm looking for evidence to help us shape those decisions, but then I see it as my responsibility. And that is actually maybe the biggest step that folks have to take sometimes to really adopt this sense of responsibility, because there's a lot of ways that we can say, it's not my job, it's not my responsibility to think about these things. In reality, I believe it's all of our responsibility, wherever we're at within our career, wherever we're at within the system that we're in, because we do have influence. We do have a sphere of influence around us where we can shape and make change. And so we are actually working to take action to eliminate these inequalities that might be around us. I want to talk on these different levels then about what is it we can do. So to start out with this individual level, part of what we have to do is we have to challenge our stereotypes and biases. Patricia Devine talks about these 5 different ways that we can challenge our stereotypes and shift our biases. And these are kind of found to be true through her research. The first is stereotype replacement. So what happens sometimes with all of these, we have to become aware of the stereotypes when they're operating. What's going on in that moment? What's being set off in my mind that's creating this stereotype? And so the first thing we can do is when we acknowledge that the stereotype is happening, replace it with something that counters that stereotype. One of the cognitive biases that our minds often do is that we look for data that supports our hypotheses. So we sort of cherry pick that data in different ways. So what we can do when we acknowledge a stereotype is coming up is we can find our examples in our mind of other examples, and we can replace it. We can say, actually, I know this isn't true because here are some examples that tell me that's not true. Another similar way to do that is counter stereotypic imagery, where we actually identify an individual who counters that stereotype and we bring them up. And so we have a racial stereotype going off about uh, folks from Central and South America, immigration status kind of questions. We bring up kind of an individual we might know and think about the ways that they counter that stereotype and what that looks like. Individuation, we take that person as that person. So I look at you as you, and I work to sift out what are these other stereotypes that really aren't about my experience with you as an individual. To think about, I'm thinking about our relationship together rather than the assumptions that I have floating around in my head. Working on perspective taking then, so really working to understand where might you be coming from. There's a colleague of mine that does work with medical professionals around trauma-informed care. And she talks about how we have to move from this question of what's wrong with you to a question of what has happened to you to get to this place. What is it that I can learn or know about your journey to this moment, to take the perspective and to think more about you and your experiences and your kind of way of seeing the world, your worldview. And then finally, taking opportunities, increasing our opportunities for contact. So ways that we can work to increase our diverse exposure to others, and to do that in ways that are meaningful and engage with diversity around us. We also have to work then to increase our knowledge and our awareness. And part of that is a mindset issue. So if we can take on the mindset of openness and curiosity, that may shift us away from a defensiveness of or a reluctance to see other people's views and perspectives. So be open and curious about what is it that I don't know? What is it that I need to seek to understand that might be going on around me? Working to educate ourselves. I don't have it in the list of resources, but I would very much encourage you all to check out, if you have not already, the IDEA Institute's work through the College of Engineering, the Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access Institute, idea.illinois.edu, who has a ton of resources where you can educate yourself. Some of those might be more general about how equity and inequity may operate in the world around us, but a lot of those are very specific to engineering and to thinking about within engineering, what are the ways that historically and currently inequity may present itself, and what are the ways that we change how we learn, how we teach, how we research. I think we also have to invite conversation and space where we can talk about these issues with one another. Some of those might be within groups of people that we know and that we're familiar with and comfortable with. And some of that might be taking risks to have these conversations in spaces that we are less familiar, where we can ask questions, and it's okay to ask questions that we don't know the answer to. Sometimes in diversity and inclusion work, there's an expectation that there's something wrong if you're asking questions, that that everyone should just know these things, and then there becomes sort of a disdain for people who are genuinely wanting to know, have to have questions that they don't know the answer to. We need to create spaces where we can ask those questions and we can have conversations and we can be open to learn. And then finally, I think we have to look to the leaders of equity and inclusion in our given fields. There is a lot of amazing work going on since this summer and before that's looking at Black researchers within given fields and their experiences. It's looking at questions of race and racism and sexism and other forms of inclusion and exclusion that might be happening within the field, and figuring out what are they doing, how are they promoting and this work and challenging inequity within their spheres. What sorts of programs and policies and processes are they creating to change that? There are also ways that we might be called upon if we're in a moment where we notice some bias or inequity emerging from our interpersonal interactions, and we have to think about what we want to do in those moments. One of the things that we need to do is just to have the conversation. We may not have that conversation right in the moment where we recognize that inequity. And so for instance, uh, I think about if we're in a big group meeting and somebody says something and you know that that's maybe inaccurate or difficult when it comes up, we might be able to say, we might say something right in that space. We might have the words to say in that space, or we might talk to them afterwards. We might say, hey, I wanted to talk to you about this thing that I heard, and uh, I wanted to let you know that I had some concern around it, or I wanted to find out more about what you meant by that. Um, Focusing on the behavior rather than the individual's character is really important. There's a video blogger, Jay Smooth, who talks about if you need to tell someone that something they did was racist, one of the challenges is that sometimes people quickly morph that into, you're calling me a racist. And so he talks about it by focusing on the behavior. He uses this analogy of if somebody steals my wallet, I don't need to chase them down to find out if deep down in their heart they believe they're a thief. I need to get my wallet back. And so focusing on that behavior rather than like who the character of that person is can be really important. This thing that happened, this thing that was said, this really specific incident or interaction, naming it and talking about the impact of that. I think it's also important to engage with some humility. Um, that helps for a couple of reasons. One, it disarms the conversation. So folks their defensiveness doesn't rise up. It also helps because then you are open to other possibilities. You're saying there's a lot, I'm still figuring this stuff out. There's stuff I don't know. I'm really curious. Here's something that happened. And I wonder how we might be able to do that differently in the future, or how we could change, or what your understanding is of that. Uh, I think something else that I encourage in those spaces is rely upon the group norms, values, and purpose that we have as a space. So in this lab, we believe strongly in critical inquiry, and this behavior that you did really shuts down everyone from this process of critical inquiry, or asking hard questions, or deeper exploration. Or you might say, there might be other sort of norms or values that you have to rely upon for your organization, maybe for your profession, that you can say, here are some of the things that it means to be an engineer. Here's one of the things it means to be part of this club. And here's why that thing you did is counter to that. And then move on. You don't have to wallow in it. You don't have to make people feel horrible about themselves. That people can have a choice to change their behavior, to grow from it. We can still be colleagues and friends and neighbors. And figuring out how we might offer resources. I see somebody who's put something in the chat. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but Fallacy said, do you think that as a standard, your department can insist that all employees working in areas where they have contact with international people be strictly for persons who have at least lived or spent 1 year in a foreign land? Most persons who have these problems are people who haven't really understood much about cultural background and diversity. That's an interesting question. I think that definitely that seems like a skill that would be valued if people had that intercultural awareness or competency. I think, when you think about structures, one of the things that sometimes we're not great at is we say, oh, we value diversity, but then we don't put into effect structures that also value this sort of diversity or inclusion or perspective. And so how do we put that into job descriptions, or into evaluations, or into learning outcomes, so that we're actually saying, not only do we say we value it, but we're also measurably valuing it. We're actually saying, like, you need to have these skills. This is experience you need to have. And then also, like, I think for job descriptions, certainly you'll often have job descriptions that say must have X number of years of such and such experience, or must have. So you can name the sort of whether it's required or preferred qualifications in there. I'm going to go to the next slide because I think when we also think about what do we do as a system, as an organization. One of the things I would really encourage if you are in an organization and you don't already have one is to build that team of support, a mentor, a buddy, an ally, especially when you are new to spaces. We may need someone who can help let us know about what might be going on, how things are happening, knowing that they're coming from their own perspective. But one of the things that I see happens often is I come into a space, I recognize the inequity, I speak up, and then it's easy for people to say, well, you're just new here, nobody cares about what you have to say, or worse yet, to like say, oh, that's a good important point. You're now in charge of a committee and you now have to solve this issue. Finding a network of support can help spread that out. Maybe I'm not the only one responding, or maybe I can strategize with other people to think about what I might do in these spaces. Addressing the concern as you're able, figuring out what's my opportunity and where can I address these concerns. I think it's also great to think about what are the questions I need to ask to get to the answers that I need to get to. I saw an administrator from a college campus talk about one of the ways that they shifted access for low-income students into their university is that when he came in, he said, what is the kind of price, ticket price difference that we can drop for students? You know, like what is so here's how much we tell students the cost is, but to what extent can we offer scholarships? And so, and he said, could we do more than that? Like what would it take to get us from a 10% financial aid to a 30% financial aid package? And how do we think about what data would we need? How do we need to ask those questions? Thinking about ways we strategize together, that we need to asking these questions also means saying, what should we do? And you don't have to have the answer all the time. You can come up with that answer collectively. I think that also as systems, especially in higher ed, we always have these aspirational colleges that we look to and say, oh, they're doing it really well. We want to do it like they do. So look to some of those aspirational institutions. Whose labs have figured out how they navigate these things, or whose programs and departments are already doing this really well, and how can we learn from them? What might we use to adapt to this context that maybe is different than their context, but working to use your national and international networks to do that. And then advocating for change using your power base. That doesn't just mean an institutional level of authority. Definitely the department heads and chairs have a lot of power to make decisions, but folks can also collectively strategize, even students have a lot of collective power on campus. You are in all intents and purposes, you are the customers of campus. You are the ones who are spending your dollars here and are offering up your labor here. And so what is the power base that we have to work from to strategize and to advocate and to make change? I'm going to stop there because I want to make sure that we have time for questions. So I wonder if folks have any questions based on what we talked about so far, and then and this may be a good point to go ahead and stop the recording if that's okay.